Before I say anything else in this video, there will be chasm clips in it. I made sure to leave out any quest or puzzle spoilers, but there are going to be chasm clips in the video, so just be aware those are something you will see if you proceed to watch. Welcome to my Ayato review. Thanks to Hoyoverse, I was able to get my hands on him early, and I've put a lot of time into trying out different interactions. I've tried different weapons, teams, artifacts, and content in general with Ayato, so I'm pretty well versed in how he plays. These videos usually reach a wide audience that may not know my history in Genshin, so let me give you a brief rundown of why I'm qualified to make this review. First off, hi, I'm Braxophone. I make lots of Genshin Impact guides and news content and meta content and just, I don't know, I make everything. I've been playing Genshin Impact since release and also making content since the very beginning. I've been very invested in theory crafting, and even though I'm not terribly good at math, all of my videos utilize my own testing combined with references from well-known theory crafters. I also spend a lot of time talking to fellow content creators and theory crafters about my findings, and oftentimes they reciprocate the same stuff that I do. Additionally, even though I have a deep understanding of the meta and character standings in the game, I still consider myself to be a waifu over meta player, because I think it's more important to play who you want to the best of your ability than feel forced to play a very specific unit because somebody told you to. And though the term is waifu over meta, it applies to men too. The point is that I play characters because I want to play them. I'm often very critical of characters when I review them, but that doesn't mean that I dislike the character or you for pulling the character. At the end of the day, I don't really care what you do with your Primogems. Being a very experienced and long-time player, I just want to put out my opinion on a character from a meta perspective, which means that in this video, I'm going to be focusing on how good of a unit that Ayato is compared to other units that fill a similar role. Keep in mind though that this video is based on my opinion, and you may find that things you enjoy are not the same as mine, or that you think the character is better or worse than I do. At the end of the day, only you can decide what's best for your account. This video is assuming that you already know what the character does for the most part, but real quickly, I'll just tell you kind of what Ayato does. Ayato is a Hydro sword user who has a very slow but cool looking normal attack animation. His elemental skill changes his normal attacks into large Hydro damage slashes that can hit multiple enemies at once and apply Hydro on a standard internal cooldown, which is once every 2.5 seconds or once every 3 hits. His elemental burst creates a huge area of effect that deals Hydro damage on enemies over time. It's sort of similar to Ganyu's burst. The damage on it is less than Ganyu's due to multipliers and base attack differences, but it's still pretty noticeable. Ayato also gives characters inside of his burst a normal attack damage buff for the duration of it, which is a pretty solid support ability. There's more nuance to it than that, but essentially Ayato's kit shows that he should be dealing damage with the stance change and also be able to buff other normal attackers. If he can't deal damage, then he's essentially just a normal attack support for a few characters because his Hydro application can only happen once every 3 hits, and therefore he's not amazing for vaporized teams, and Freeze would have better options. That being said, Vaporize is workable, but it's just not as good as someone like Child or Xingqiu. And now, with all of that being said, let's move on to the pros and cons of Ayato. One of the very first things that I noticed with Ayato that I was pretty happy to find out was that his damage isn't awful. Almost every single character in Inazuma that's come out has been a worse counterpart to some character from Liyue or Mondstadt. Obviously there are exceptions, but in the case of Ayato, I don't actually feel like he's that much of a downgrade. He's closer to a side grade. In this instance, I compared him to Child because Child is sort of the premier Hydro DPS if you're not counting Xingqiu. And even though Child's meta role is as an enabler for Xiangling, he still puts out really solid damage, especially against multiple enemies. But in Child's case specifically, he gets exponentially better the more enemies there are, whereas Ayato is just going to grow linearly based on the amount of enemies. That being said, when Child is against just one enemy, his damage does fall off significantly. Obviously, he's enabling Xiangling, and at that point, you are just playing Xiangling. Child is just, driving the reactions. But in Ayato's case, he actually has decent single target damage. Even though Child will still be a better pick in a lot of scenarios, against bosses, it does seem to me like Ayato is the more effective pick, and that's been my experience so far. We may find that that's different if there are other teams that come out that change how we look at Ayato, but based on my experience playing him early, this is the impression I get about his damage. Another super positive thing I noticed about Ayato is that he actually can be played in a lot of free-to-play friendly teams, and by a lot I guess I mean relative to a lot of the newer units that came out. But I've found that he's extremely valuable in Taser. Now, one of the bigger issues that Taser has is that there's no healer, and you will have that same issue with Ayato until we see an Electro healer come out that can also battery Beto. Ayato, but if you're playing well enough to not have to take any damage at all, or if your Beto shield is just stacked for some reason, he fits really well into Taser. That has by far been the most successful team I've played him in. He's able to proc Beto's elemental burst in this team, which is just super awesome to see. And of course with Fischl, you just have less energy problems on Ayato, so it's actually pretty solid. Another way you can run him fairly well is as a Xiangling driver. Now, one of the bigger issues I found with this is that sometimes you're going to actually end up hitting a forward vaporize with him instead of Xiangling, and that can actually lower your damage by quite a bit, but to some extent you're able to output pretty solid damage anyways. Ayato's not going to be as good as Child is for enabling Xiangling, but the option is there. Another massive pro that I found with Ayato, and this is probably going to sound like a small thing to you guys, but you can move between the slashes in his elemental skill. You are not locked into one place for the entire duration, which is just awesome. To be honest, when I saw footage of him on the dev stream, I was really concerned that he just wouldn't be able to move. He'd just be planted as soon as you use his elemental skill, and you just couldn't get out of it until it was done. Kind of like Yaimiko when placing her turret. She feels very, very clunky because you literally just can't move at all until the end of the animation. Ayato does not suffer that problem. Obviously, he can't move while he's casting the slash, but if you need to dodge between hits, you can do that, which is really solid for Ayato. That already makes him much better than I was anticipating for him to be in my book. I was also really pleased to see how big the area on his elemental burst was. I was a little concerned that it was smaller, I guess, and that the area damage wouldn't actually be that significant, but it actually functions kind of similarly to Ganyu. The size is about the same, and its damage output over time is pretty good, and it provides a great support utility for Yoimiya, who's my main, so obviously I have a little bit of bias here, but I really like what his burst is able to do. Now, it's not actually all positives, but I'll talk about that later. On top of all of that, if I wasn't clear, Ayato is a Hydro character, and we just don't have a lot of those on the roster, and so getting a new Hydro that does something different, that doesn't wield a catalyst, is actually really cool. Now we just have to wait for the Hydro Polearm or the Hydro Claymore user. Please, Hoyoverse, I'm begging you. But him being a Hydro unit is very solid because it makes him a good freeze support as well. It's not perfect because he does have internal cooldown that prevents his Hydro from being constantly applied, but in general his freeze capability is pretty good. I think there's also a lot of value in how a character is built and whether or not they have free-to-play friendly weapons and artifact sets, and I'm glad to say that Ayato has so many different artifact sets available to him that he's actually in a really solid place for that too. You're not going to have to go resin diving to get the completely new set, because even though it is actually good on Ayato, there are other sets that perform very well. Like the 4-piece Gladiator set actually affects his normal attacks, 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set works for him in a freeze setup, and 4-piece Heart of the Depths is just amazing on Ayato. The fact that you're able to get 35% normal charged attack bonus and 15% hydro damage bonus just by casting his elemental skill already makes that a good set, and it's just fairly consistent. That's why I like it. If you do have bad RNG, you're not going to want to farm for the new set. The thing is, his signature set is a lot of RNG. It doesn't really matter as much for him because his best teams don't involve him using Vaporize. So because of that, the new set's actually not too bad on him, but if you don't want to spend all that resin, you don't have to. And as far as weapons go, like I said, there are free-to-play craftable weapons that work for him. Specifically, the Inazuma weapon is very good on him because it's got good stats and it helps him get his burst up with its passive. In general, Ayato just has a lot of good things going for him, and I'm glad to see that this character isn't a total flop like a couple other characters during the Inazuma series. But again, this is all my opinion. We're actually going to move on to the con section now, where I can talk to you guys about what I kind of didn't like about Ayato. In my time playing Ayato, there's a couple things that I've noticed about playing him that just are kind of inconvenient and make him feel like not as great of a unit as he could have been without completely breaking the game. One of these things is that his burst costs 80 energy. Now, I know that seems like such a small gripe to have, but for Ayato specifically, energy generation is kind of a big problem. Now, there's a couple things that alleviate that, right? You can run a battery in your team, you're gonna have an easier time with energy generation. You run a second Hydro unit, easier time with energy generation. You run any kind of energy recharge, you get more energy back, and he has a sneak passive that gives him energy when he's below 40 in his gauge and off the field. But the big issue here is that none of those really work to alleviate his energy issues in a way that is conducive to him being a powerful unit or being played correctly. If you're running a second Hydro with Ayato, you're running a character like Kokomi, Mona, or Barbara. You wouldn't run Xingqiu because the entire point of having another damage dealing Hydro unit would be so that you don't have to use Xingqiu on that team most of the time. Xingqiu is reserved for your your Pyro DPS and for your Taser comp, but if you have Ayato replacing Xingqiu and Taser, then Xingqiu can go to your other team. And you guys may not know this, but Kokomi's energy generation is not that high, and Mona's energy generation is basically non-existent. She has some, but it's really small, and then you have Barbara. So realistically, you're not going to be running double Hydro with Ayato unless there's some kind of groundbreaking team where you end up using Xingqiu as well. But as it stands, that doesn't seem to be the case unless you're running him as a Xiangling enabler, in which case I could see the value in running Xingqiu with him. But what about energy recharge on Ayato? Well, you don't really want to do that outside of substats, because if you give him a bunch of energy recharge, you're taking away from his damage, and as we discussed earlier, his damage is one of the most important parts of his kit. All of these energy issues are what leads me to my next major gripe, which is basically just that his second Ascension passive feels almost useless. It's aimed at making him not as energy hungry by generating 2 energy per second while you're below 40 energy and off the field. But in my experience playing Ayato, it doesn't really affect that much, because 2 energy a second would mean that to get from 0 to 40 after using an elemental burst, you would need to wait 20 seconds off the field. Now the good news is that you won't be waiting 20 seconds to get to that number, since you have other characters on your team that are going to make particles. You'll use 3 different character skills that'll give energy to your team and likely give Ayato a decent chunk of energy as well. So you'll use his burst, shuffle through support, switch back to Ayato and use his skill, and then by the end of it, you'll have just over 40 energy. Think about this. If you're assuming 8 seconds to get through all of the character's skills, then his passive generated around 16 energy, and by the end of that 8 seconds, you're already past 40. That skill generated around 16 energy. But by the end of that 8 seconds, you're already past 40 energy, meaning that the passive doesn't really do much for Ayato in a proper team setting anyways, because you're going to generate a small amount of energy while he's off the field for a short time, and then it's going to freeze at 40, and you're still going to have half your gauge that you need to fill up with other energy sources. They could have made this passive a million times better by making it 40 to 80 energy, making it so that once you're past the halfway point, it passively regens. Because the main issue here is that by starting at 0, you're assuming that he's not collecting any particles from killing enemies in the rotation. He's not collecting any particles from your teammates if you want to get that value out of the passive. But because he's going to be collecting all of those particles from your team's elemental skills and from enemies who die, he's going to hit 40 and then he's going to stop, and then the passive is going to be useless. And maybe I'm being too picky about this, but to me this passive seems like it could have been replaced by something much better, like perhaps not having an 80 cost burst. Anyway, speaking of passives, his first passive is kind of a joke. Essentially, when you use his skill, every time you slash, you get a damage bonus based on Ayato's max HP up to a max of 4 stacks of that damage bonus. Now, the damage bonus you're getting from the stacks of his skill are already pretty minimal, and the only real difference his passive makes is that you'll start with 2 of those stacks out of 4 and max them out once his water illusion explodes. But because of how fast he already attacks, he's already able to get out 15 attacks without any attack speed buffs at all. You max the stacks quickly anyways, you don't need a passive to do that for you. Now at Constellation 2, you can get an extra stack up to a maximum of 5, and this passive will help you get to that maximum, but again, this is a passive that could have been replaced with literally anything to make Ayato just feel better to play. It's like they introduced a useless feature stack system into his kit so they could solve it with another ability because they didn't want to make him too broken by giving him an actually useful passive. And this seems to be the theme with a lot of Inazuma units, where they just refuse to give them anything useful because they are too afraid of that character being viable on a level that is too similar to what is already good. That being said, it's not all that bad. I just feel like he would play more or less the same without either of these passives here. Kind of moving back to the energy generation thing too, this is something that I didn't mention earlier, but his particle generation isn't that great. During a use of his elemental skill, he's able to generate anywhere between 3 and 6 particles if you get all of your slashes in. Now that being said, this is based on a timed cooldown. Having more slashes is not going to get you more energy particles. And it's kind of a pain because anywhere between 3 and 6 particles is a pretty significant difference to have on something that's not a skill shot, right? Because with Beto's shield, if you hit a perfect counter or if you get a level 2 counter, you get more particles. That's a skill shot. Same with Yunjin, you get increased particles if you get to charge level 2. But with his skill, it's just completely random how many particles you're going to get. You're either going to get 1 or 2 up to 3 times during the duration of his skill. And if you're building a character optimally, you need to build their energy recharge, assuming an average case or the worst if you want to make sure that you can have their burst up in time, which is essentially going to mean that you're going to build him assuming that he's either going to get 3 particles all the time or 4.5 particles all the time, and he's going to need a lot of energy recharge. And I know I previously mentioned attack speed. While he does work with attack speed buffs, most of the attack speed characters in the game don't pair particularly well with him unless you're talking about Yunjin C6, which is a problem for players who are either free to play or low spenders. Now, to be honest, this isn't that big of a deal because most of his optimal teams aren't attack speed teams anyways, but it is a bit of a bummer to see that even if you can increase the amount of slashes you have in his elemental skill, that doesn't mean that the team is going to output more damage. And lastly, my final final gripe with Ayato that I had after playing him for a while is that as of patch 2.6, he doesn't fit in any team that we've discovered as a best pick. Now, I have tried tons of different teams with Ayato. Like literally, I have just been playing this guy so much and I've been trying so many different characters, and I cannot find a single team where Child doesn't perform better, or where Xingqiu doesn't perform better, or where Kokomi doesn't perform better, or where there's not some substitute for Ayato. So in general, he's not gonna always be a direct upgrade for your account, and that's why I feel like he may not be a super necessary character to pull for. But now let's go ahead and talk about my final thoughts, where I can kind of elaborate on this a little bit more and we can wrap everything up. To be honest, this video has been very long, but I just felt like I wanted to be as detailed as I could be about how I felt about the character. So with that being said, here's kind of how I feel about Ayato. I have very much enjoyed my time playing Ayato pre-release because he introduces a new fun mechanic into the game with his elemental skill. He looks great, has great voice actors, fits well into a lot of teams, and feels satisfying to play. Like he packs a punch. Every time I use his elemental skill, it feels like I'm doing damage even if I'm not really doing damage. And I actually do feel like he's a pretty fun character to play. And I think this would be amplified a bunch if I didn't already have Child on my account, because he's a new Hydro DPS unit that also has supportive capabilities, whereas Child is sort of a Hydro DPS or enabler, but they can both fill in similar teams and provide that Hydro DPS satisfaction. With that being said though, I don't necessarily feel like Ayato is a perfect unit, and I feel like he definitely has some issues that could have been circumvented by Hoyoverse if they weren't afraid to power creep already existing units. And it is a little frustrating that they do this, because even if they made him not have energy issues, he still wouldn't be a broken unit, and he still wouldn't always be a replacement for any other units in the game. With that being said though, I definitely feel like Ayato isn't the worst pull you can make. He's not the best either, but from a meta standpoint, he's really not that bad of a unit. And at least in comparison to how I felt with Yai after playing her for a while, I definitely feel like I've enjoyed Ayato a lot more. Just be aware that Ayato's not always gonna be an upgrade. He's likely gonna be a side grade for your account, meaning he's going to be a character that can be good for teams that you want to run, but not one that you actually need. This is a classic case of pull for the character if you like the character and want the character, because he does his job well enough to clear the content, but he's not anything groundbreaking either. So don't necessarily feel like you need to pull for this character, but if you do like him, you're not going to ruin your account by doing so. For players who don't have Child or Kokomi, he can actually be an upgrade though, because you can use Xingqiu on a different team now. If you have a Pyro DPS carry that you want to use, Xingqiu is now free and you now have Ayato in his place. So in my opinion, after testing Ayato pretty thoroughly, I think he's a solid unit, but he's definitely more of a luxury character if you have Kokomi or Child. So pull for him if you want him, and if you don't, well then you already know your answer. Do keep in mind though that it's pretty likely that Kazuha will get a rerun pretty soon, because Hoyoverse wouldn't want to miss out on all that money.